HMRC, and indeed all the departments that work to devise and then deliver all the economic support programmes that were put in place. They worked tirelessly, selflessly, and without complaint. And I think they demonstrated exceptional skill and professionalism throughout. It was, to me, a very fine example of public service. And I felt personally very fortunate to have both their advice and their support during what was an incredibly difficult time for the country.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sunak. On the subject of constructive dialogue and looking ahead, the terms of reference for this inquiry require the inquiry to identify lessons to be learned, to inform preparations for future pandemics across the United Kingdom. And so in each area of questioning, I want to very much focus on your reflections and lessons learned from both what went well, and that's important, and where you think a different approach might be beneficial in a future potential emergency. And over the last 4 weeks, the inquiry has heard a lot of evidence about what has happened during the economic response and received a lot of statements addressing that in detail. And so I don't just want to ask you questions about what could or should be done next time, if there is a next time, but how, from a practical perspective, that might be achieved. Bearing in mind it's easy to say, well, you could do this or do that, but the real question is, how do you actually make that happen? Can I, to assist you, Mr. Sunak, and those following your evidence, just set out the basic structure that I'm going to follow in my questioning, so you know the order in which we're going to deal with the subject, and we will work through these in the course of the 6 sessions of evidence that we have with you. So first, I'm going to examine preparedness as part of the initial response, look at the scale and nature of the shock, the economic shock that the country was facing, then look at some systemic and structural issues in terms of decision-making and delivery. I'd then like to move on to funding, and in particular funding for the devolved administrations. And then to explore the policy response, looking at, in particular, the coronavirus job retention scheme, first of all, then the self-employed income support scheme, then Kickstart, then the uplifts to both universal credit and working tax credit, then the uplifts to both universal credit and working tax credit, then examining the statutory sick pay rebate scheme, then looking at loans as an umbrella heading, picking up different loan schemes within that, grants as an umbrella heading, picking up different elements of grant schemes, and then I'd like to ask you some questions, Mr. Sunak, about access by the voluntary community and social enterprise, then to examine the economic impact of long COVID as a discrete subject, and then finally, and I'm sure you'll be relieved that it's a finally, to come to giving you an opportunity reflections that you, and to look at any recommendations or thoughts for the future that you wanted to share with the inquiry. We obviously will pick up reflections as we move through, but I want to give you, as I have with every witness, an opportunity at the end of your evidence to make any points that you feel are important points of learning. As I've said, you were appointed on the 13th of February of 2020 as Chancellor. You'd previously been Chief Secretary to the Treasury, so you had been within the Treasury, is that right, before that?
Yes, that is right.
And there had been a number of appointments on or about that date. We've heard Lord Sharma was also appointed on the 13th of February. And we know that the current Governor of the Bank of England came into post a month later, 16th of March. And we understand that the budget, but that is a regular fiscal event, as opposed to some emergency budget, was programmed for the 11th of March. So regardless of the pandemic, your first job was going to be, or your first big job was going to be to deliver that budget on the 11th of March. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. And so you had been, and I'm just setting this context really to remind us all of the scale of the challenge that you and officials at the Treasury were facing at the time. You had been Chancellor for just over a month when, on the 16th of March, the Prime Minister recommended avoiding all non-essential contact and travel. And then a week later, there was an announcement of lockdown that effectively put the economy into something approaching hibernation. And this was therefore a significant economic crisis unfolding that was unprecedented. You informed the nation on the 17th of March in a speech that the coronavirus pandemic is a public health emergency, but it is also an economic emergency. And you put it, Mr. Sunak, in this way: we have never in peacetime faced an economic fight like this one. And it was an economic fight that resulted, the inquiry knows, in fiscal interventions to a value of in excess of £350 billion over the course of the pandemic. So I've just set that context so we remind ourselves of where we were in February and March of 2020. From your perspective, coming new into the job, for example, you were having to react to a situation for which there was no playbook, as it were. Nothing like this had happened before. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I mean, you mentioned I'd been in the Treasury. I'd been appointed Chief Secretary to the Treasury the previous July, so not a huge amount of time in that context. I was obviously very new to senior government, and then it was a surprise to be made Chancellor in the middle of February. And at that point, I inherited a budget date which had been previously set, that the government had announced and was being worked towards. So my immediate job was to, put together a budget in the space of a few weeks, which in ordinary course I think would probably be what you would imagine to be the most difficult job you'd ever have to do as Chancellor. As it turned out, that was really one of the easier things I had to do, given what then unfolded over the next few days, weeks, months. And at that moment, things were moving very quickly. So even during the budget preparations, it was clear that what was happening with the pandemic was escalating. And so I wouldn't say we necessarily rewrote the budget, but as well as the regular budget that we had planned, what we then ended up having to do midway through that prep was to deliver a set of COVID-specific responses in that budget, which I'm sure we can go through. So the budget itself was almost a budget that delivered largely what was in the 2019 manifesto from an economic perspective, but then also had a set of interventions specifically designed to deal with the pandemic as we imagined it would be at that moment. Obviously, we had to build on those pretty considerably and quickly thereafter. So, all that is to say, already the budget contained some things, and then we iterated very quickly thereafter. And to your point, there wasn't a toolkit. No. There was not a playbook that you could pull off the shelf that said, well, this is how you tend to deal with pandemics in the same way that you somewhat have with other economic shocks or financial shocks. So you did have to draw on some things that we had done in the past, and we'll get into that with the specific interventions, but largely listen to the health and medical advice as to what was likely to happen, and then do the best you could at designing economic interventions which would help support the country through that period.
Yeah. I mean, these may not be the words you'd use to describe it, but we heard from Sir Charles Roxburgh, who kept a diary, and caveating that in that it was a personal diary that he shared with the inquiry. The way he put it in an entry on the 17th of March was, from his perspective as one of your senior officials looking at what you had to do, he wrote down that you were in a position of having to pull a rabbit out of a hat, is effectively how he was looking at things in terms of the situation in which you found yourself. And really building on that, a lot of the schemes, and we're talking here about fundamental, significant schemes like the coronavirus job retention scheme. As you said, there was no playbook. You were having to devise those at speed. We heard from Dr. Loynig, an advisor, about 55 hours of time to conceptualise and announce the furlough scheme as it became known. And what sort of pressure did that place you and your officials under in terms of the need to deliver at speed?
I think taking a step back, maybe actually slightly going back to your previous question, I think there was just an enormous amount of uncertainty. I think that was the number one challenge. We were dealing with something that no one had dealt with before, and there was uncertainty about the scale, the potential duration, the behavioural response, and the wider macroeconomic impact of all of this, both from the MPIs and then how the economy would respond. And that's what made it so tricky in terms of figuring out what to do. And as then you just said, I think speed was paramount, because one thing that was crystal clear that this was happening very quickly and was about to have an extraordinary impact very fast on millions of people, their livelihoods, and millions of businesses as well. So, not only are you trying to do things that have never been done before, you have to do them as fast as you humanly can, and that's why, at the opening of my evidence, I did want to put on record my thanks, because as I felt I was new to the job, I was new to being in cabinet, having a job like this, and then having obviously to deal with something like this and do the best job you could for the country, having the support, the advice of people around you who were working, incredibly hard at particularly those first few weeks, was something that will stay with me for the rest of my professional life. It was an extraordinary effort by a whole number of people, trying to serve the country in the best way they thought they could. And maybe if it's helpful, I can talk a little bit about what we were trying to solve for. So when we were sitting there in these meetings, and you've probably heard a little bit about this from Charles's evidence, our understanding of what the virus would do, or the impact it would have on the economy, what we did know is what we were trying to prevent, and that was what we call economic scarring. We knew that there was going to be an economic shock. Our understanding was that it would be temporary. I think our understanding at the beginning was that it would last several weeks to a few months. And what we were focused on doing is making sure that the temporary shock did not have long-term serious economic consequences, and that's what the term economic scarring means. And there are various transmission mechanisms for economic scarring: damage to aggregate labour supply, damage to the capital stock, damage to what we call total factor productivity, which is how you knit things together and create things out of them. And so, that was what we were trying to do, and I think that was the right set of objectives. And then you talked about the how, and earlier on, that then led to a few things that we were designing schemes and designing economic policy to deliver in terms of outcomes that we could be measured against. And the first was to prevent unemployment and protect living standards.
I don't want to cut you off, but I am going to come on to those priorities
shortly.
I just, at the moment, if we could, and if I don't keep this promise, you can haul me up about it, but we will come on to that very soon. Just before we get there, just going back to this point about speed and there being no playbook, you referred to that. In ordinary times, if we're talking about governance in ordinary steady state, things like the CGRS, schemes like that, would have taken months to work up, to consult upon, to implement in ordinary government proceedings. How important was it, did you think? Yes, there was no playbook, so you couldn't dust it off and say, what do we do in this situation? But did you find that actually having an entrepreneurial approach to decision-making was a benefit? In other words, being freed of the usual strictures of government systems and operations?
I don't think it necessarily was strictures, but I think the necessity of speed just meant that everyone recognised we didn't have the luxury of time.
Yeah.
And I think that was everyone's driving force, really. I can't think that there were particular processes or structures that somehow we did away with. It was just that we had to work quickly. And as we'll get into later, I think there was an acknowledgement from the beginning. I mean, use the word entrepreneurial. I'd probably say iterative, maybe the other way to characterise it. There was an acknowledgement early on when I was talking to the team that, of course, we weren't going to get everything right straight away. I think that would have been, surprising given the speed at which we were operating and the scale of the interventions we were designing and putting in place. So there was a recognition up front, and I, encouraged the team to be comfortable with that was okay, right? We couldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good, and we were going to have to acknowledge that we would iterate as we go. I think there are general lessons for policy making, I think, in any case, about that, what they call in the Cabinet Office a test and learn approach and an iterative approach to policy making. I think that's a good thing. I think that's what you see in the private sector for sure. I, in general, think that is a good thing for government to try and adopt, even in peacetime. It requires a recognition on everyone's part that, you are then putting things out there that are not perfect day one and then iterating them over time. But I think in the context of a pandemic, everyone was comfortable with that, or should have been, because we had to get things out fast. Otherwise, the consequences would have been severely negative.
So that iterative approach has benefits in all times, in your view. And so when we look at playbooks and the idea of playbooks, and this is just why I'm interested in this issue, in terms of how much planning you can ever do. You don't want to plan to the point where you lose the ability to be agile and to react to what's going on. In other words, that you just follow line 1, line 2, line 3. You've got to still be reactive. Yeah,
and I've followed some of the evidence that you've had during this module, and I think this is a really interesting question. To what extent should we come out of this saying, here's a playbook for next time? And I probably, and again, we'll get into it in detail when we go through the individual interventions, my overarching reflection would be we have learned an enormous amount having been through this once, and we have a set of tools that we developed, we iterated, and no doubt can be improved in the future. But I would slightly guard against the idea that whatever happens next time, you can pull something off the shelf and, as you said, just kind of go, right, line 1, line 2, plug it into a machine and off you go. Each economic shock, each economic crisis is going to be slightly different, and it's important for policymakers at that moment to be agile and responsive to the situation they face, and not be so mechanically thinking, okay, well, just because we did this last time, it's the right thing to do in exactly the same way. So I think you use the word agility. I think that's right. It's just responsiveness to the situation you face, having the agility to respond to it, to be flexible, but also then to acknowledge, even next time, a willingness to be able to iterate as you go, would be my takeaways. Having said that, all of that will be benefited from the fact that we have now developed a whole new set of tools this time around, building on some tools that we had previously, and that will help.
Yeah, we heard some evidence from Dr. Loynig, who his stark evidence was, he was anti-planning, but actually in questioning, I think where he landed was that you can build the architecture now. You can put in place the delivery mechanisms, or you can get the data streams sorted out. You can do that sort of planning, but then you need to also retain agility in terms of reacting to the particular shock. And is that more or less where you?
I would broadly agree with that characterisation.
Yeah. Okay. So that was you had to be agile. You had to be iterative because you didn't have a playbook and there weren't these structures. So that's the starting point. Moving on then to the scale and nature of the shock, and when we've discussed that, then we'll come on to the point you were making about what you were trying to do, what you were thinking about. But in terms of this pandemic, this wasn't a shock, and Andrew Bailey spoke about this, that arose in the economic system or in the global financial markets. This was a health crisis that then had a knock-on effect in terms of an economic shock. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I think normally when you're responding to an economic shock, part of your job is to try and stimulate economic activity. Here we had the almost reverse situation where the government was deliberately suppressing economic activity. So this is why it was unprecedented, at least for modern policymakers, to have to grapple with and to figure out what the right set of economic interventions would be in that context.
And how important did you consider it to be to really understand in the Treasury the nature of the shock and the extent to which it was a supply-side shock and it was affecting global supply chains, or a demand shock, or the interrelationship between those things?
No, that's exactly what we tried to do, and you'll see it in my evidence and indeed in my evidence in the previous module too. The calls that I had even during those budget preparations with the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, and the Chief Scientific Advisor, separate from the various cobras and things we were at. I spoke to them specifically with my team to try and glean as much as I could from them in those early days about what this would look like, so we in the Treasury could then do the best job we could of understanding the impact that would have on the economy, how we should think about it, and then help devise the right type of responses. The first iteration of which you saw in the budget, and then we built on thereafter.
Yeah. I mean, ordinarily, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, you set the economic policy direction for the country, and you announce measures in a budget. And so, in a sense, usually the Treasury is in control as much as it can be, or any government department can be. But here, was the Treasury finding it had to be reactive to other events rather than able to control those events, given the nature of the shock?
I think, of course, the Treasury and the economic response had to be responsive to and based on the health interventions. So I think it's kind of a statement of obvious in one sense, but the Treasury couldn't drive the conversation, especially in those early, and nor should it have done, in those early days and weeks. And I went through this in some detail in my evidence in the previous module. My strong recollection of that period is largely the response being led by the Department for Health, together with the medical and scientific advisors, and us largely, following the advice that they were putting in front of ministers and the Prime Minister. And then obviously the economic policy response would be based on that. And as that changed, then we had to change the economic response or anticipate where it might go.
And that's really what I'm coming to, in that we know from all the other evidence the inquiry's heard how rapidly the health position was changing.
Yes.
And so from your perspective, did that mean that the economic position was changing just as rapidly behind the health development?
Yes, that's right. And I think perhaps maybe slightly underappreciated how, and I going back over all those individual meetings of that period, even when I went over it in preparation for the previous module and now, I'm struck by how much that health and medical advice was changing in those early days. I think people, even I was struck by that rereading it. And of course, the economic response then had to keep up with that, and you saw that because we put a set of things in place for the budget, and then very quickly we had to then go and do a whole host of other things. And what we did in the budget wasn't that it was out of date, and in fact many of those things persisted for a long period throughout the pandemic, but we had to do significantly more than that. And that is a reflection, as you said, of a rapidly evolving health situation.
And that pace and the speed at which things were evolving presumably supports your view about the need to retain agility and to take this iterative approach.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And the Treasury has a great institutional ability to deliver, I'd say, set-piece economic policy announcements because of the budget process. And what we had to do, in the organisation, and they responded, absolutely brilliantly to that, and reflect on the time. We almost had to deliver 5 budgets in the space of about 2 weeks. In terms of the scale of what was being announced, they were bigger than pretty much any budget that had ever been announced by any chancellor. And it felt like for a period we were doing one of those every 2 days for that first 2 weeks. It was to go back to what you were saying before, it was an incredibly intense period, those first 2 weeks. And as I said, every second day, I was popping up. It felt like doing a press conference announcing something, and then behind all of that, there was 48 hours of non-stop work to get to that point, and then after that, go and make sure all the implementation was happening, and then move on to the next thing. I think that probably looking back at it, slightly benefited from the fact that there wasn't really time to panic. There wasn't really time to worry. You just, certainly my approach to it individually was you just had to focus on the problem in front of you, run at it, solve it best you could, get on to the next one, and just keep going and not let it consume you. But the organisation, as I said, responded exceptionally well in those early couple of weeks. And probably the other thing to say is, we were all new to working from home at that point, right? I think people forget that. I think Charles in his evidence made an observation about that, and it's a small point, but we were not set up with all the things like Teams and everything else. There wasn't, I think, even the right set of plug sockets. I think Charles mentioned in the Chancellor's meeting room in number 11 Downing Street. Which
no
is
telephone socket.
That was it.
That's
which
right.
Is why there's, we were kind of crowding around the kind of almost sitting room because that was where you could plug in all the various things and have a conference call, and that was what it was like in those first couple of days. So I think, given that, I was very grateful to the team for rising to the challenge to get me what I needed to go out and do what I had to do, which we'll come on to in a second.
And in terms of what the challenge was or became, and again, just for context, we've seen the very first briefing you had as Chancellor about the pandemic, and at that time there was still an expectation it might be contained even in China, that it might not reach the United Kingdom, and then months later the budget, that's all consigned to history. But in February, March, was there still a hope, perhaps even an expectation, that it might be capable of being a relatively short-lived economic shock?
Yeah, you can see that in the evolution of the various minutes coming from the SAGE meetings and the packs that were prepared for ministers in the COBRA meetings. That was very clear. There was a set of things that people were working towards. And I remember clearly at that time, especially in those early conversations, a lot of what the medical and scientific community were advising us was not to go too early, because they were with the various interventions, because they were worried about public, I think, acceptance of them, and they needed to maintain a duration. And so that they were quite focused on getting the timing right. And the quotes are in my evidence about, I think, the chief scientific advisor at one point saying it's important not to go too early because these things need to be maintained for a period of time. And clearly, as you said, things just kept escalating. Things were put in place. Then ultimately, even at the end, that last few days, I think the Prime Minister said to people it was a voluntary social distancing and to avoid hospitality and leisure on the advice from the scientists. And schools were not closed at first. then the advice was that they should be closed, and that was followed immediately. And then even at that point, there was a belief that voluntary social distancing, together with school closures, if there was, I think the number was 75% compliance, would be sufficient to manage the virus, to deliver the health outcomes. And then 2-3 days after that was said, it was decided that wasn't going to be achievable, which is why you had to move to a full mandatory lockdown. But to your point, the health and scientific advice was changing every couple of days, and that's what characterised that period. And going back to your point, there was a sense that it could be contained at the beginning, and then it would last for a period of time, more than a couple of weeks, but a period of time. And that's what we initially designed the economic interventions to do.
And that's why I'm really setting this ground, because you're having to be reactive in the Treasury to health events. But as Chancellor, in terms of setting the economic response to the emergency, the economic response to a short-lived emergency may be very different in terms of its policy and implementation to the economic response to a long-lived emergency. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that obviously sounds right. I mean, again, looking back, and I think it's probably better for when we get into the individual interventions. It's not obvious what very significantly large decisions that we would have made that would have been very, very different at the beginning, knowing if you knew that it was going to be for longer than you thought. I mean, there might be some micro design details, but I'm not actually, as we get into it, I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case. And that's whenever it's appropriate to get into what we were solving for. And then, so at least you have an understanding.
Well, let's come on to that now.
Yeah, because I think, as I said, a lot of that is slightly time agnostic in a sense.
No, understood. So here you are. The health position is worsening. That's having an economic effect. What was it you were having to take into account in terms of what you were trying to prevent, what you were trying to achieve, and why?
I mean, I won't repeat what I said about economic scarring, but that essentially is the kind of economic theory underpinning what we were trying to do. And just to put it simply, it's to try and make sure that a short-term economic shock doesn't lead to long-term damaging outcomes for the country, the economy, for people and their livelihoods.
Can I just pick up on that?
Yeah.
Does that mean that, so far as it is possible, you want to take interventions that mean that, first of all, the economy can recover quickly and it can recover to the same level or as close to as it was before the emergency?
Yes, it's about protecting that potential output of the economy. And then if you go, what does that mean? Well, it means preventing mass unemployment, because obviously if you have very large-scale unemployment in the short term, there can be permanent damage from that. So, protecting job matches and keeping people connected to their jobs is important. Linked to that is obviously preventing firm failure, both in and of itself and because of the impact on employment, and protecting, as you described, that potential output of the economy. So otherwise healthy, solvent businesses, you wanted to make sure that they would still be there when this finished, to have the recovery and not lose that output. We always had a strong eye on the most vulnerable. We knew this was going to be an incredibly serious event for the country, and you always want to make sure, I certainly wanted to make sure, and the team knew this, that the most vulnerable in society, that we were making sure that we had an eye on what was happening to them and could support them as appropriate. And then you also wanted to design things that would allow economic activity to recover when appropriate, because long-term economic growth is a function of the efficient allocation of resources in an economy, and what you needed to allow happen at the appropriate moment was for those normal forces to be able to resume. It's not good long-term for an economy, for things to carry on in an artificial state. You believe, as I do, in markets and their ability to allocate resources efficiently. So you wanted to make sure that as appropriate economic activity and normal economic allocation mechanisms could operate and markets could function. And then lastly, but not least, of course, was ensuring value for money for the interventions and thereby minimising the fiscal impact. So as a kind of set of things, there's 4 or 5 things there that were always at the top of our mind. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm sure probably they were written down somewhere, but that was a set of things that we were solving for, fitting in this overarching desire to avoid economic scarring best we could or minimise it. And as you'll see, as I describe those things, there's an inherent tension between these things. And I mean, all economic policy making is about trade-offs for the most part, but this in particular. And yes, of course, minimising fiscal impact, ensuring value for money is incredibly important. Designing schemes that could ensure economic activity could resume is, of course, important. Where we probably put more weight in those early days is, as I said, protecting unemployment and business failure. And there's, as we'll go through, there's an inherent tension between these things. And part of my job was to make decisions on where to design policies, which things to weight more or less at any given moment in time. And again, there's not a perfect science to that. That's a judgment, and those are judgments that I made on a regular basis throughout the pandemic. But as to give people, like I said, an overarching sense of what we were aiming for, what our economic objectives were, those were the economic objectives that as they were important to me throughout. Yeah. And maybe one other point I'd make is that those are all the very practical, measurable economic outcomes. I probably underestimated it at the time, but I had a sense of it, but it became clearer over time. I think there's also an incredibly important job for leaders in a situation like this to provide reassurance, and particularly in the sphere of economic policy. I think one of your expert witnesses, Professor Brewer, I thought made an astute comment about that modern economy, modern society depends, I think he said, enormously on confidence. And uncertainty is a dangerous thing, he said. I think in a crisis like this, there was an enormous amount of anxiety, and rightly so. I think people feared for their jobs, their livelihoods, their families, alongside the health anxieties they had. What it would mean for their economic financial security, what it meant for their family's security, what it meant for their house, their small business they'd built up. Were they going to keep their job? Would they have a job to go back to? Would they be able to make their mortgage or rent payments? And so, my role in part was not just to get all the policy things right, which was it was early on to just provide reassurance to the country that we would get through it, that we would do what we could to help people, and as I said, I think that is probably an underappreciated but an important objective, certainly from the person in charge of the economic policy response. And I tried to do that early on through the various press conferences and the language I used and the interviews I gave. But I think in the future,
can't just get the policy bits right. You do have to be able to just communicate and give people the reassurance at what I think was an incredibly anxious time, as I said, for people and their businesses.
Well, I referenced the speech you made on the 17th of March, I think, at which you publicly made that sort of statement of standing behind people. But can I just pick up on that in terms of reassurance? Because I think it's a point that Andrew Bailey was making in his evidence as governor when he was talking about the bank having an obligation to act. When I was putting to him the narrative of why not just do nothing and sit back and see how things unfolded. And he spoke about the need, he put it perhaps slightly more starkly than you have, going beyond reassurance to the need to prevent disorder.
And he meant that in a social sense, disorder. But I think he was making the point about the need for the people of this country to understand that their central bank, their chancellor, was going to stand behind them economically. Is that what you?
Yeah, I felt that, and said it's probably we're sitting here five years later, but those early days, those early weeks, that it was, as I said, it was an incredibly unsettling and time for everybody, and we'll get into the, as I said, later on the individual things, but I think somebody provided evidence in one of your sessions. They were talking about the loans and helping small businesses, but I think actually their comment applies more generally, and they said something to the effect of it felt existential, and I think that is actually a generally good description of the overall situation. Is it felt existential, and that's why I think Andrew's comments, which I haven't seen the precise paragraph that you're referring to, I would agree with. I think said obviously Prime Minister providing overall leadership, but those of us in charge of the economic response, part of our job is not just to get the policies right, is to give everyone in the country that reassurance and confidence that the people in charge know what they're doing and are going to be able to do their best to help get the country through it. I think that is an important economic policy tool, as well as just the right thing to do from those who have that responsibility to lead at that moment.
Yeah. It's easy to think about government intervention sometimes in terms of how much money people get from the government, depending on their business or their circumstances. But in terms of household incomes and protecting household incomes, would it be fair to say, when you ran through your priorities, that your priority was to protect household incomes insofar as you could through the preservation of business, preservation of jobs, retention of job matching, and in that way?
Yes, I think, and I think in that first press conference or something, I hope always open. It wasn't going to be possible to save every single person's job, and people were going to experience economic hardship as a result of what was happening. And I thought it was important to be honest with people about that up front. There's a balance. You want to provide reassurance, but I think a degree of candour is also appropriate. And once again, my job to get that balance right. I tried to do both things. I think actually, as it turned out, the impact on household incomes and living standards, particularly for the most vulnerable in society, we'll get into it in the right section, I assume, so I'll save it for then. But I think the overall results on that were stronger than I would have perhaps anticipated going into this, and I'm very proud of that. I mean, it was something that we had an eye on throughout, and certain policies were designed specifically with that in mind. But when you go back and look at the impact on deprivation or poverty or disposable income for those who are the most vulnerable, as the track record through the pandemic, I think we'll find is much more favourable than anyone might have thought. But more generally, I think the living standards probably come as a consequence, as you said, of protecting people's jobs and that job connection, protecting business failures, etc., etc. But obviously some policies, and universal credit being one in particular, which targeted that as well, and furlough.
Yeah, we heard from, again, Dr. Loining about, for example, the approach taken in the United States of America, where this idea, he termed it helicopter money delivered through welfare rather than through job preservation, though he explained that really that wasn't a policy choice by the US in his view. It was more a fact that they couldn't have delivered the sort of scheme you delivered in terms of job retention because they didn't have the systems by which to deliver it. But it's fair to say, is it, that you put that protection of jobs and recovery of business at the forefront of the response?
Yes, I did, and I did that because I thought that was the best way to, as I said, minimise economic scarring, the long-term damage on the economy, on people's employment security, financial security, and I'm glad when we come on to it, that what happened on unemployment was considerably better than anyone had forecasted at the early stages of the pandemic. So we were successful in preventing that mass unemployment, which going in was the biggest fear. The biggest economic fear going into this was there was going to be mass unemployment. And that might speak to what Andrew was perhaps saying about the social disorder. The scale of projections people had about 12% unemployment rates, millions and millions of people without a job. Clearly, that's not something that the country had experienced in a very, very long time, and reasonable to worry about the social impact of that. As I said, that was what we're particularly focused on averting. And I think there are different approaches. One thing I'd say is it's probably not that binary, in the sense that it's not either or. We did both. Right? We put support through the welfare system, and we created the furlough scheme to protect jobs and job matches, and we did things to help business, and we created hardship funds for people who might have not benefited from those or needed extra help. So, you can do a range of things. I think that's the right thing to do. It's not as binary as, well, it's either this approach or that approach. And I think most countries, when you look at it, adopted a mixed set of tools. And particularly with CJRS, when we get to it, I think most countries ultimately decided that was a sensible intervention, and many other countries did something similar.
And as Chancellor, you were obviously authorising significant public spending. These interventions, we know, cost a lot of money. And you, as you've said, we're trying to stand behind the country, if you like, and business and individuals. But were you also having to factor in that, as Chancellor, you would also have to bring all of this to an end when, hopefully, the country recovered? In other words, this wasn't a blank cheque that could just go on forever. So you were having to bring things in, but also you may go from hero to zero, be the person who had to end it, because you had to then start, or the country had to start living within its means, effectively. Yes,
very, very much that was in my head throughout. I mean, I am, by instinct and experience and everything else, a fiscal conservative, right? That is what I believe. I believe in controlled government spending and a lower tax burden as a result of that. And I think a lower tax burden comes from control over government spending and borrowing. And so this was obviously atypical in terms of my general view. But I said, I think probably in one of those early interventions, I said, this isn't a time for ideology. I think I might have used that exact phrase or something to that effect in one of those early press conferences. So we had a particular situation that we were confronted with, and that meant, okay, I might in general be someone who believes in a smaller state and a lower tax burden, but this was a unique crisis, and it required a particular response where the government did have to intervene and did have to do these things, which I thought would be in the long-term best interest of the country. And you're absolutely right. Of course, I knew that there's no such thing as a free lunch, and that's why where you could target things more appropriately and effectively, so that you were ensuring better value for money, reducing the fiscal impact, you would try and do those, and that happened throughout. And that's why, I think in the last budget I did sorry, not the last budget I did, but the spring 21 budget, I stood up and said, that we do now have to pay for these things. I didn't leave the tab in that sense for not to be picked up. I was honest with the country, and now we had to put in place some tax changes, which I, of course, hated doing, and to your point, but it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to intervene, and then it was the right thing to make sure that our public finances were then put on a sustainable trajectory thereafter, which is why I had to, as Chancellor, deliver a tax-raising budget in the spring of 21, precisely because these things are not free and needed to be paid for. Probably, if just to put it in context, in terms of the scale of the support you mentioned, I think it's interesting looking at it. Probably the best way to measure it is as a percentage of GDP. And actually, when you look at the scale of the intervention here, I think the IMF have probably got the best database which looks at countries consistently, we were very much in the middle of the pack, actually, at about 14% of GDP being the total scale of our response. And you had, countries that were a bit lower than us, so Canada 13%, France and Italy 12 and 13%, and then you had, countries that were more than us: Japan 15%, Australia 17%, Germany 18%, and the US 22%. So in terms of the overall scale, we're kind of in the middle of the pack. So some people might say we should have been at the top end. Some people might say we should have been at the bottom end. But for better or worse, we were roughly about average in terms of the overall quantum of the support. And then that splits, because again, I think it's probably underappreciated. In terms of that quantum that you talked about, depending on how you measure it, about 325 billion, give or take, about half of that is what I would call purely economic support. So things like furlough, self-employment scheme, loans, grants, the things that we're probably going to talk most about over the next day and a half. And then about half of the response, or half of that quantum, actually relates to the health response and the broader public services funding. So the funding for the NHS, for PPE, test and trace, vaccines, social care, education, transport, other public services. So it's not precise, but very roughly the way to think about it is we spent broadly on average compared to most advanced countries, and what we spent was about half purely economic response and half the broader public services response. And that's, I think, is just a good framework for people to have in their heads when they think back over what we did.
Well, in fairness, Mr. Sunak, you make a perfectly proper point that this module is looking at the economic response, but there were other things, a lot of other things government was doing in addition to the purely economic response. So.
But as you said, all of which ultimately do have a fiscal impact. And it's not just the economic things that have a fiscal impact, all the interventions on public services to support for the NHS, all those have a fiscal impact too. And in the round, of course, that in the long run, needs to be paid for.
So I hope that fairly sets the context in which all of the decisions we're going to examine were having to be made, not just in terms of the pressure to stand things up quickly and to adapt them rather as you go along, but also in terms of the ultimately hard decision to decide when to withdraw support, so it doesn't either undermine the economic recovery or become support that just can't be funded. So can we move on to looking at systems and structures of decision?
Just before we do, Mr. Bright, maybe I think you've summarised the context very well. I think the only thing that we didn't touch on, just to bring to life what that early period was like, was you would have got some of this from Andrew, but I can give it to you from my perspective, was just what was going on in the gilt markets at that time. And if I think back to that period which you said was intense and filled with anxiety, certainly for me, that was particularly troubling. I mean, I've been Chancellor for felt like 5 seconds, and then you could see a very material tightening in UK financial conditions. And you had the first thing that happened was bank CDS spreads were widening. The CDS spreads are the kind of, think about them as the insurance premium that people can buy to insure against a bank going bankrupt, right, or defaulting on its debt, right? So that's the kind of way to think about it. So that the price for that insurance, these CDS spreads were widening, which is never a great sign. And then you had, I think, on March the 18th, it was the single biggest one-day change in real yields or something since bank independence. So that happened one day, and then the next day there was another move where there looked like there was a bigger move for UK gilt rates than there were for other places, which again is never great. And then you had a failed gilt auction. And that was the first time we'd had a failed gilt auction since the financial crisis. And so one after another, these things were happening. And I think we've all, over the past couple of years, seen the importance of the gilt markets to the health of the UK's economy. Obviously, I come from a financial background, so something I have some familiarity with. But that was acutely stressful. In the context of having to do all these other things, I was sitting there, worried about the UK's ability to fund itself. And in the end, we organised with the Bank of England something called the Ways and Means Facility, which I talked about in my evidence, which thankfully we never needed to use, but essentially as a backstop for the government. If it can't raise the money it needs on the bond markets, it can go to the Bank of England instead for a temporary period of time. And it was last used again in the financial crisis, but it's a pretty exceptional measure. Thankfully, we didn't need it. But I think that was all in my head of all the things that I was kind of worried about, as well as all figuring out furlough over here or loans over there and everything else. Was that was happening at exactly the same time. And to your point, on thinking, gosh, are we going to be able to borrow the money we need to put all these things in place? I need to have that in the back of my head as well, because that really would be a disaster if there was a problem.
No, quite right. You should mention that. I had a little note saying risk to markets, and we skipped over it. But don't worry. Quite properly that you mention it. And as you say, Mr. Bailey touched on that. He justified the bank's actions to go big and go fast, as he described it, on that basis, that there was a real risk to the markets, that there was significant market volatility, that there was a need to take decisive action, and that would have been a very serious threat had it transpired. So all of this going on in the background of your decision making. Can we move then to really pick up the sort of systems and structures around that decision making, if we could. So moving on slightly in the list of topics, and I just want to pick up some sort of high level concepts really, and the first of those is that, I mean, generally speaking, do you agree that if it's possible, accepting pace, speed, the need for confidentiality in different times, accepting all of that, where possible, to bring together your delivery experts at the time of formulating policy is a good idea, particularly when responding to an emergency?
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't think it would be one you'd say no to. And so far as the Treasury was concerned, there was a very good example of that, I think, in terms of its relationship with His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and the policy partnership that we've heard a lot about, which is unique to those two departments, and probably because of how they're configured. Is that right?
Yes. Obviously, I'm trying to think of the exact legal link. I mean, HMRC is a body of HMT, and it has a minister that it's reports into, but obviously it's operationally independent, and essentially is the delivery mechanism for the most part of most of what the Treasury does. So there is an existing relationship between those two departments.
Yeah. And that meant, for example, when you were looking to stand up the CJRS, you could have the delivery experts in the room at the same time as you're formulating the policy, and that made it all deliverable quickly.
It was. It would have been impossible without. I'd go as far as saying that there was an extraordinary team at MHMRC, who I won't embarrass by naming them all, but. We had that from the beginning. I think the Perm Sec at HMRC has described it as a shared vision and a single team approach, and which I really felt that it was. And it's normally not everyone's favourite government agency, HMRC, but I can honestly say in this period, we were all lucky as a country that they were able to deliver something as effectively as they did. Which, let's be candid, I think most people thought that it wouldn't work. In fact, certainly at least more than one journalist told me afterwards they were all ready to write the stories about how the whole system would fall over when it went live. I certainly had a very stressful morning talking to all the IT people that day, I remember. And so it wasn't just that the policy and the delivery, down to the thankfully we had a brilliant guy again. I won't embarrass him by mentioning him. To literally go through the IT to make sure that it would stand up to what was going to be millions of people claiming and not fall over and could do all the things we needed to do. All of that was part, as I said, single team, there from the beginning, involved in everything, and it worked brilliantly well. And as I said, I'm very grateful that all happened so seamlessly. As I said, I wouldn't have been able to do this without that.
Okay. Now, it worked that well, as you've described. The natural reaction might be to say, right, well, every government department should work with the Treasury in that way. Having been Chancellor and Prime Minister, I assume you're going to tell me that wouldn't work either, because it's just not possible. It's not how government is configured.
Look, of course, government is configured in departments, and departments have their equities, and that tension is not necessarily a bad thing, by the way, and it's a healthy thing. For having done both jobs, I wasn't obviously Prime Minister during this period. It was important that the Prime Minister during this period, important for me as Prime Minister, to get those different department equities in a policy-making process. But, I would say, I looking back, I'm pleased that we managed to, I think, in large part replicate that policy partnership, I think is the phrase that you've used to describe it, particularly with DWP and BEIS as well, in the areas where we were doing policy together with them. It wasn't as intense as the HMRC relationship. Well, that's because what we were doing with them was probably less intense when we were doing it, and we'll come on to loans later. That obviously was intense. But it was still, we created these, I think, we called them cells, actually I'm not entirely sure why, but someone came up with that name, and we had these cells, and actually I do think it requires a bit of, I tell you about lessons learned and things. One thing is it is always going to rely slightly on the relationship between the ministers, is my sense, unless they're told to do something by the Prime Minister. I was really fortunate, and I think you've had evidence from both of them. I had very good personal working relationships with Alok, who was Secretary of State at BEIS, and Therese Coffey, who was Secretary of State at DWP, and I think both of them would have said the same thing when they've been here. So we had a good personal working relationship, and that really matters. And because if that's not there, then the Prime Minister has to force you to do it, and that's probably never perfect. So thankfully that is the case. And the teams take it, because the teams will take a steer from that. Teams in other departments, they need their Secretary of State to essentially say to them, this is okay, you can go off and have meetings directly with Rishi as Chancellor, and I don't need to be on every single meeting. You keep me up to date, and I'll talk to Rishi. But that's kind of very practically what needs to happen.
Can I just come in there? Because, you might say, well, the problem with that is, what if you've got two Secretaries of States who can't stand each other?
Well, in which case, as I said, it would require the Prime Minister to lean in.
Well, he might not like them either.
Well,
what I'm really getting at is just leaving it to personality is slightly dangerous, isn't it? Don't you need to bake in that sort of muscle memory of cooperation?
You can bake in that muscle memory, but again, my honest reflection, you might come out of this and say, great, there should be this structure stood up or that structure, but it is, in reality, it is going to depend a bit on personal relationships. We might prefer that it wasn't, and you can kind of, I mean this in the nicest possible way, structure your way out of it or create some process out of it.
Can I just give you a different perspective that isn't about structures, but I think this is a point that Charles Roxburgh made. I mean, he was against structure, but he was talking about the point you've made. It's up to the Secretary of State to really set the agenda and the tone, but that in the civil service, there can be training for civil servants that is focused on cooperation and cross-departmental working. It doesn't change structures. It just, that's what I mean by baking it.
I do agree with that. And I think, look, I'm sort of sidetrack, but maybe helpful. One thing I've been, not being in government now, so one thing I was, and I hope is the case, was always positively struck by is the Darlington Economic Campus that I established as Chancellor, and the reason I bring it up is it's an interesting model where multiple departments are in one building, and that is obviously I don't know, unique but rare for how government functions normally. And the senior civil servant there is a Treasury person, and Beth Russell has done an extraordinary job of leading, growing that organisation. But whenever I was there, both as Chancellor and as Prime Minister, because I continued to work out of that office as Prime Minister and always spend the time to walk around and talk to particularly the junior officials that were there, I was struck by, to your point, that there was, I think, a greater culture of collaboration and cross-working, because probably just the physical setup of that building is such that people are there from 5 or 6 different departments, and so they're on the same football team or running club or quiz team or whatever it is, all of which I'm proud that they now have there, which is great. So I think there is something to what you're saying. You can do a good job of trying to just say that this is a good, sensible thing, because obviously it improves policy making in peacetime as well. So of course I agree with that, and supportive of efforts to foster that collaboration. But in something like this, I would just say, you do always need the Secretary of State, because ultimately those civil servants work up to their Secretary of State, and it's important that they do, right? I mean, you do need clear lines of accountability, and so I think it's important for Prime Ministers to be aware of where that might be an issue if they thought it was going to be an issue. Thankfully, in this case, I genuinely don't think it was. That we worked very well with DWP. That their officials, TIS's officials, would be in the meetings with me. Similar for ALOPS, and I think both of them have said that they never felt there was any issue there. And those were probably the 2 departments which we worked most closely with outside of HMRC.
Can I ask another question about structures and systems, really about consultation? And I just want to pick up on a point that Dan York-Smith made in his evidence, and I'll just read it to you so you know the point he was making. He said, "I think in general on everything, more consultation is better." I suspect that's not controversial.
That more consultation is better?
Yeah, consultation is a good thing, was basically his message.
I mean, yes, but again, let's...
Can I give you the but? Can I give you the but?
Can I do the but? Or you want to do the but?
Well, let me tell you what he said, and then
right, fine, sorry.
Agree. He said, but I think the context was that consultation can come with a cost in terms of the time it takes, the people required to do it properly. So we're probably giving the same but.
I think the same but.
And particularly in the early part of the pandemic, we had to move very, very quickly. And had we done additional consultation, it would have delayed implementation. And was that the trade-off?
Of course it is. That's common sense, right? I mean, consultation, all else equal, fine. But things are not all else equal. And we were in a situation, you said you painted the picture of what we were grappling with in those early days. I don't know if Tim's number is right, but knowing Tim, Dr. Loynig, I'm sure his 55 hours probably is right if Tim's done it. But you think about that, 55 hours, great. I mean, you can take an hour to do something else. It's quite a meaningful amount of your time slot to get that thing done, and then you repeat that for everything else that you're doing. So I agree with what Dan said. There is obviously a trade-off. That said, when we go through these things in a bit more detail one by one, I think you'll find, and I think the evidence supports this as well, hearing and reading what everyone else has said, there was a very good degree of engagement with all the relevant people in each sector. I don't just mean industry sector, just whoever the right stakeholders were for a typical intervention, whether it was SAYS, whether it was CJRS, whether it was bounce back loans, whichever it might be, whichever intervention. I think there's a whole body of evidence showing engagement with those people, and in most cases they were all intimately involved in formulating and drafting the detailed guidance. So it's all very well I stand up and announce something in broad parameters. Ultimately, that has to then get implemented through quite detailed guidance, and all these people were involved in their various different ways in helping to draft that guidance, making sure it was workable, and sure, would some of them have liked more consultation? I'm sure it was ever thus. And would they have liked it a bit sooner? I'm sure. But speed was of the essence, and ultimately I think we got to the right balance.
Well, just in fairness to you, I hope develop that with an example. If you look at SAYS, which went live on the 20th of April, the inquiry knows from your statement that on the 25th of March, so almost a month earlier, you were having calls with the FSB, the IPSE, which is the Self-Employed Employers Group, and the TUC to discuss thinking on the design of SAYS. So this wasn't bringing them in after it had been worked up. This was bringing them in early. Is that the sort of thing you mean, where you were having those conversations?
Absolutely. Now, and actually, you mentioned the SAYS example. I remember that vividly because I think even the day before, I remember, well, not the day before, but the last few days as we were getting that policy exactly right. We only had a few days, so it probably might have been the day before. On reflection, but it was, it was also the IOD, the Enterprise Nation Creative Industries Federation, the Private Hire Association for taxi drivers. There were several groups that I remember speaking to in the immediate days before, and the team did, and it was like that on everything, and where we could, where it made sense. Of course, I wanted to hear from the people who were directly affected by this, because ultimately there's no point. I have no interest in standing up and announcing things designed in an ivory tower that don't survive contact with reality. It's going to be self-defeating for me, right? And I not only need these people to make sure I understand about what they need, what will be most helpful, how do their businesses in particular work to make sure we can design these things properly. I want to make sure that they, you stand up and announce these things. We talked about reassurance and confidence. I want to make sure that they also say, thank you, great, that is going to work, and we can go and tell all our members they can breathe a little easier tonight. So there's simply no, there's no desire not to do that. As I said, it would be self-defeating. So if it has not happened in the way that someone wants, it's because we were moving at a speed that meant it wasn't possible, not because we didn't want to.
Can I pick up a final question on that, and then we'll have to take the break? But in terms of spoken about the personality of the Secretary of State and change from time to time and set the direction, but on that front, do you, having been through this, think that there is a need for formal systems and structures to ensure that consultation, or do you think it's something that has to be more organic, and what do you think would be helpful? Because there's the risk that people might drop through the cracks of consultation if there isn't an established body of people who are talking to each other in normal times.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think this works pretty well, at least during my time in government, but worked pretty well. And I don't, I look back on this time, I felt that my team in the Treasury were constantly talking to people. My advice was, and they knew I would want that, was peppered with, we've spoken to this person, this person, this person, because they knew that I would ask, well, how's that person going to react? What's that person going to say? And I was someone who, quite, to use a slightly more investment term, focuses on the unit economics of things. I don't want to just design macro policy. If I'm doing something that impacts the hospitality industry, I wanted to make sure I understood, what an average pub's revenue and costs were, and they knew that that's what I would want to know. So, my advice always had that information in it, and they were constantly out there talking to people, whether it was Charles having his regular roundtables with big businesses, or all the team talking to all the trade associations and making sure we understood what their individual members were going through, so that we could get things right for them. That was very much the culture and the expectation from me. So this is about sharing and getting consultation external to the Treasury, which I think is important. I know there's been some talk about economic, do we have enough economic people? I was always thought the economic analysis I received in the Treasury was superb, and we had a ton of brilliant people there, and they were also very open to going out and getting me other things that they thought would be helpful for me to hear, or where we didn't have the expertise on something, they would seek it, and then we would share that openly around Whitehall, whether it was with Bays, whether it was feeding into the Number 10's weekly dashboard, and that all improved. And the one thing I should say, talk about structures, I think we covered this in Module 2, but clearly the creation of the COVID task force at the centre was a hugely welcome development, because it did kind of systematise and meant that there was good flow of information into one central place that could synthesise. And then I think that the Cabinet Office and Treasury ran weekly economy dashboards for the PM. We did meetings for him, monthly updates, etc. I think he, in his evidence, has said he felt the Treasury were open and transparent in sharing what he needed. His private secretary, I think, in evidence, has said exactly the same thing. So that's my general view as to that topic. And I know you've heard people's perspectives on it, but my overall view was, there's a good degree of engagement and consultation. The culture, importantly, is one where they knew that that's what I would have wanted anyway, and all of them would have wanted the same because we wanted to get our things right. And then, we were very open to sharing that, particularly with number 10 as they needed it, and the task force, so they had everything they needed to advise the Prime Minister.
Okay, thank you. My lady, I think that's time for the break, and then after the break, I just want to finish off briefly this topic, and then we'll move on to funding for the devolved administrations.
You remember the breaks, Mr. Sunak. I shall return at midday.
All rise.
Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Maidi. I want to move on to funding as soon as we can, but there are just two really further points I want to pick up about systems and structures. The first is about transparency and sharing of analysis. And if you bear with me, Mr. Sunak, as I just give you the context to the question, really, in terms of other evidence that we've heard in the inquiry. We heard some evidence from Robert Harrison, who was the head of the Directorate General for Analysis in the COVID-19 Task Force. And he explained about an epi-macro model that the Treasury had. And the first he heard about this was actually during the inquiry, when he read the evidence. And James Benford accepted that the model had not been shared, describing it as a departmental position. And I just want to pick up on this. I mean, departmental position, in normal times, the Treasury as a department, for good reason, market sensitivity, budget, PERDA, so on and so forth, has reason not to share its thinking. Is that reasonable in government?
Yes, I mean, of course, there has to be a concern for market-sensitive information.
Yeah. And I'm not suggesting, but I want to check this. I mean, no one came to you and said, shall we not share this model with you?
Yeah, I don't, to be perfectly honest, I don't quite know the specific model that you're referring to or he's referring to. There was an enormous amount of modelling done by lots of different people throughout the pandemic. And in any case, the primary responsibility for the modelling would have, the people who were pulling it all together was actually coming centrally from that COVID task force.
Well, it was later in November, by November 2020, when Mr. Harrison came to the Directorate General. But I'm just talking about earlier than that.
I mean, this model that you're referring to presumably was after that, because I think, in fact,
that model was later, and the point was it wasn't being shared. And it's just really this. You talked about, from your perspective, you were somebody who liked to see what people thought about things, to get as much information as you can, and to share information. And I'm just wondering if really...
I do recall having reviewed the notes. The Treasury, I think... I mean, to the extent where they actually had an event or a session with academics from Imperial and LSE from memory that was partially organised by the Royal Economic Society to go through epi-macro modelling, and they'd put together a kind of classic SIR model, which is the epidemiological model, susceptible, infected, covered, and I can't remember the other, the R, together with the NIGEM model, which is the National Institute's general economic model, I think. But I think they actually had a full session on it. I mean, let alone not sharing it. It was done in consultation with a bunch of external academics. So that's all I can remember about the epi-macro modelling. I think in general, there was a lot of sharing of information, as far as I was aware, with the team at the centre, at number 10 in particular.
I'm not suggesting, given the number of decisions you were making on a daily basis, that you would have any recollection of this or that it had even come across your desk. But really what I'm getting at is when we're looking for a future emergency, and you've got, obviously, analysis is important and sharing data is important. Would you encourage as much transparency as possible in terms of data sharing and sharing of modelling as between departments?
I mean, in general, yes, although I would, and I'm glad that was the case, and I touched on this earlier, and I think you've seen from the Prime Minister at the time who said in his evidence that HMT was transparent in sharing economic analysis, and his Principal Private Secretary at number 10, or one of them, also said the same thing. And I think you've heard that from the senior official at Bayes as well. So I think that was happening. What I would say is, there's a difference between a kind of, workings and analysis as things are being developed, and I don't think you kind of say, well, okay, here's what we're doing today, what we're doing the next day, as you're trying to figure something out. If you've got something that you think is helpful, sensible, that is going to be relied on for decisions or policy making, sure, and I'm sure it would be, because why would you not want to? If I'm going to go make an argument in a meeting or something about something, I'm going to base that on some analysis. I'll want to be using it in the meeting where we have that decision. But you work on lots of things all the time that don't end up getting to that point where they are useful, reliable. At which point, I don't necessarily think that every single thing that you probably worked on needs to be then given to everybody. That would be a bit odd, I think, and cumbersome.
That point is well made and accepted, but I think you've really hit on the potential mischief of people not sharing analysis, or the fact that they've got a basis for analysis, is that ministers or secretaries of state will all have their own analysts who might be giving them analysis that is influencing their position on things, and others don't know why they're adopting that position, what's informing that position, if things are being kept secret rather than being shared, once they are worked up, once they're being presented as analysis.
I'm not.
Do you
I did. Because at the end of the day, if you think about it in practice, you're in that situation as you described. Ministers got a point of view. If someone said something in a meeting and said, okay, well, if you do this, then all these things will happen, I'm likely to probe it, right? And if I said something, someone's going to probe me, and I'm going to have the evidence or the analysis to back up my point. And I would imagine the Prime Minister would say, okay, well, interesting, that's different to what that person is saying. I want to see that, or why isn't that in my papers? So I think in practice, it's highly unlikely that anyone could get away with trying to promote some point of view, or indeed make some decision, or the Prime Minister make a decision based on something that they haven't had the data for. So I think in reality, I'm not entirely sure that would be a problem. As a general sense, I think there was on modelling in general, my recollection of it, and particularly with the gentleman you mentioned, what I wanted was more the other way, because I'm someone who's comfortable with models and has spent a career before politics having to build them, interpret them, use them to make decisions. So what I wanted was, and I think actually this is a good reflection for the future, is these models on these big things, can't be black boxes that are then just presented to politicians. And that was certainly my frustration, and we talked about this in module 2. And I remember that gentleman when he was doing the thing, and my strong point of view was, what I wanted was to be able to understand the underlying assumptions that go into the model in the same way I would if I was analysing a company in my old life. It's all very well projecting things to happen in the future, or the model says X, the model says Y. Well, that's a function of the assumptions that have been fed into the model. And as policymakers, ultimately these things are judgments. Right? Those assumptions are judgments, and it should be for the elected politicians to be the ones that ultimately say, well, I want to see a base case where the assumptions are this, and this. And because on each of those assumptions, there will be reasonable people who can disagree. And that, in my view, there wasn't enough of that earlier. And that's what my pushback, not pushback, but my kind of desire at that point was, look, I don't want to just be presented with a model that says this is what's going to happen. I want to be able to say, well, I've got a different point of view, which I think is reasonable on this aspect, and I want to be able to the assumptions to be iterated, and then I want to see what it is. And I think that is an important lesson in general.
Accepting that, though, that is, isn't it, an argument for transparency about the model that you are using. In other words, you can't begin to probe the assumptions unless A, you know about the model, and B,
my point exactly is, if anything, there wasn't the transparency the other way. My point was, I was often presented from the centre, or you'd have a model that came out somewhere. And I don't think it's anyone's particular fault, but for me, I wanted not just to be given a set of papers that said, well, here are all the projected outcomes and path of the virus from some modelling exercise. I wanted to have had the ability to know, well, what are the underlying assumptions, and what's the sensitivity analysis on those. And look, that, of course, happened over time, but as I said, I would probably wanted more of that earlier, and I think that would be helpful in the future.
Well, can I pick that up then? Because I think you've already said that you viewed the establishment of the COVID-19 task force as being a good thing because it was a coordinating function through the Cabinet Office. We know that the Directorate General for Analysis was part of that. And our understanding of the Directorate General is that what it was doing was exactly what you've said. It was bringing together all of the assumptions and models of different departments and presenting them in a sort of snapshot that said, this is the range of opinion, this is where we are in terms of confidence, and laying that out. Did you find that a helpful approach?
I from my recollection of it, was that it needed some prodding and pushing on my end, and probably my officials, because I'd asked them to get it to do exactly that, rather than being presented with slightly more, here it is. I think it took a bit of iterating to kind of have that be the approach. And again, as I said, that's where the engine that was meant to pull stuff together was, but was presenting the scenarios from memory. But I said it took a bit of prodding to get them to adopt that type of transparent approach on all the assumptions underlying what was being the assumptions underlying the output that was then in the slides.
If you get to the point of the roadmap, by then things were starting to come together in that way, weren't they? In terms of
yes, I forget the exact date that the task force was created, but I think not to cover too much old ground, it definitely was a helpful thing.
Okay.
I mean, not least because, again, it's a small point, but I think Treasury is used to working with the centre, with the Cabinet Office and Number 10. I think that, even if there's not a formal structure, there's a lot of muscle memory about those three bits of government working together. DH is less used to that, probably institutionally, and that especially is why the task force function is so important, because it properly made sure everything was getting joined up at the centre.
Okay, thank you. Can we move on to next topic, funding, and in particular devolved administrations funding? Now, helpfully, you've been both Chief Secretaries of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer, so you're probably well placed to answer my first question, which is essentially who makes these decisions on devolved administration funding? Is it the Chief Secretary of the Treasury or the Chancellor, or is all this done in conjunction in terms of the actual allocations?
I think it's probably quite a broad question. In normal times, much of this is mechanical.
Through the Barnett formula.
Yes, which is a big topic. But,
we're not getting into that topic,
but there's a mechanical way in which funding for the devolved administrations is allocated according to a set of formulas, where when UK government, even in peacetime, has a regular budget, that will trigger a set of funding consequentials for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland according to this set formula, and that has been the case for a long time. Typically, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury deals with the DAs on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. That wouldn't be the Chancellor, and so I did that as CST, and that continued. So they're the primary person that has meetings with the finance ministers, the quadrilateral group. It's called Finance Ministers Quadrilateral, FMQs. They happen on a periodic basis, and again, it's out of the scope of this, so I'm jogging my memory out, but I vaguely remember as CST, I was having conversations with the various finance ministers about, there's always things that people are looking to tweak or improve about the various mechanisms that govern funding, borrowing between the DAs and UKG. So I remember having meetings like that on those issues during that time.
Now, we know and we've heard evidence about how the usual funding frameworks were developed during the pandemic, the introduction of the Barnett Guarantee for the devolved administrations. I don't want to spend time with you going over ground we've covered with Mr. Barclay and others, but I just want to, given you've done both jobs, just pick up your view about a future framework, please, if we can. And essentially, the inquiry's expert, David Phillips, has suggested there should be essentially a combination of guarantees and or some capacity for borrowing, additional borrowing for the devolved administrations, but for that to be determined on an ad hoc basis, depending on what the nature of the future emergency is and how it develops. Where do those propositions sit with you, having performed both functions?
Again, I'm quite loath to be prescriptive, because I think every shock is likely to be different and require.
Pausing there, he's not prescriptive. He's suggesting it should be ad hoc.
So I tend to agree with that sentiment. I think my overall reflections are, I think certainly on the economic side, the vast majority of the economic interventions were UK-wide. So I think it's just, of all the things we're likely to discuss today and tomorrow, with the exception of grants, all the other big economic interventions, universal credit, furlough, self-employed, all the loan schemes, statutory sick pay rebate scheme, all of those were UK-wide interventions. So I think that was a good thing. I think that was appreciated by devolved administrations, and there's lots of evidence from them about, I think, their appreciation for those and the reflection that they could not have delivered those themselves. It reflects the benefit of the UK government and having the benefit of the UK government balance sheet at times like this, because I think that would have been probably difficult otherwise. So that's the first thing. So lots of the funding really relates to that other half of the spending that we talked about at the beginning that was on public services, less than it does the economic interventions. But so it's important to have that distinction so we know what we're talking about. And look, my approach is, Ben, and I think probably the upfront guarantee is a good balance between the various considerations. It's obviously a helpful thing for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland's governments, administrations to have some certainty about funding rather than have to wait for the announcement. Clearly that is of benefit. I recognise that, which is why we did the upfront guarantee, and you heard from Steve about that. We increased it multiple times. And that balances the need for the UK government, though, ultimately to have control over UK government borrowing and debt. Right? UK government politicians are elected. They are responsible and accountable for our overing borrowing and debt levels. You touched on it in the previous session. Ultimately, I was making the decisions about what to spend and therefore borrow, and then I had to take responsibility for making sure that we paid that back and standing up and explaining why that people's taxes were going up after the fact. So that's a hugely important part of democratic accountability, and those are hugely important decisions. And it's, I think the UK government, whenever it is, can't outsource to anyone that. And so what the guarantee does is give that flex, but still provide the government with kind of overall control over the total quantum. And borrowing, as you said, is the other way for that to happen. Now, we did do that in the pandemic, and we increased the borrowing flexibility. We allowed more flexibility on what are called CDEL to RDEL switches, where devolved administrations have a budget for capital expenditure and day-to-day expenditure. And normally you limit the movement between those for various reasons, but we said you can do more of that. And there was more flexibility about carrying forward from one year to the next. So it's not just borrowing. There are a few other flexibilities that UK government can deploy that, again, fit within the overall framework of UKG having oversight, accountability for what's happening to the balance sheet, but providing where it can that extra degree of flex to devolved administration so that they can respond in the way that they want. And I think the expert, he said, I think his general view is what we did allow. I think he said allow them to respond effectively, and I think that's broadly right. So the balance we struck, I think, is right, and I think that would be my starting point for someone who had to do this in the future as well.
All right, thank you. Can I just pick up one other issue about devolved administration funding that really stems from your explanation, quite proper explanation, that most of the big interventions here were for the UK as a whole, and you spoke about CJRS, and I think just the emergence of Omicron perhaps provides a basis for exploring this point. And there was an issue about reinstating CJRS given the emergence of Omicron. and you had some advice about whether, if the devolved administrations mandated premises closures before the UK government had, they should be able to access a CGRS scheme if it was re-stood up before England had moved to those restrictions. And your decision ultimately was no, they shouldn't be able to access the scheme. So the position was that if Scotland locked down 2 or 3 weeks before England, say, then employers in Scotland wouldn't have had access to the UK-wide scheme in that period. Now, in this pandemic, things were symmetrical, more or less, in terms of impact. So I'm not really making this point as a critique of what happened here. But of course, going forwards, if there was another pandemic, it might not land in that way. It might be asymmetric in its effect. And I just wonder if you have any reflections about how you would square that circle. UK-wide decisions, but what if there's that asymmetry to the pandemic?
A couple of broader reflections, actually, just to finish up from the last one as well. It's one of the things that was brought up was you talk about asymmetric responses in general. We'll come to CGRS. Now, look, people will have different views on this, but the Barnett formula does provide more per capita funding to the devolved administrations than for England in the first place, right? So it's roughly, depending on the IFS have probably the best source, but I think they would say £1.25, £1.30 for each pound spent in England. Wales is about £1.15. Now, so in any case, there's more funding per capita going. One might argue, even if it's a symmetric shock, there's asymmetrically positive funding going. Now, the response to that would be, okay, well, base needs are potentially higher. Now, that is to open up a kind of long-standing point of debate. Independent commissions in the past have assessed relative needs of the DAs, and although we're obviously not reopening the Barnett formula here, it's kind of relevant for thinking about this in the future. Now, the general sense is, and I say this generally and not to open up a huge can of worms, is I think generally from what and again I'm a little bit out of date, I think generally the sense is that we've put a floor in for Wales, so the funding uplift roughly matches their extra need. So that's quite well matched. I think from memory there is a sense when the last time this was looked at is the funding that goes to Scotland is in excess of their measured need. Now, again, I haven't got the most up-to-date figures, so whoever's in this job is the starting position is there is UK government, UK balance sheet is in any case allocating more money potentially than need in the first place because of the Barnett formula. So that is something that will in any case need to be thought about in any response about asymmetry and symmetry. Now, of course, Scotland and Wales, if they want, also have the ability to do their own tax raising. We talked about borrowing. This goes to the heart of this thing. Now, I, as UK Chancellor, had to stand up and, as you said, make all these difficult decisions about raising taxes to pay for the pandemic support because I thought that was the right thing to do to get our public finances back in order. I obviously didn't love doing that. You obviously, there's a political price that comes with these things. It is what it is. That was the right thing to do. I wanted to do it. But you can see there where the tension is, right? And that ultimately, if the UK Chancellor is a person who has to, and the UK government is carrying the political consequences of borrowing fiscally today and then having to deal with that tomorrow, it's quite tricky to then say we are happy to give carte blanche to whoever it might be, without thinking through that implication. I think that's very natural. And you say squaring the circle. I'm not sure there is an easy way to square that circle. There will always be a slight tension there. Now, one way to square that circle is, as your expert said, is, the DAs can do something. They can borrow from the UK government, which will be cheaper, and then pay it back over a period of time, and maybe that is something that could be discussed at the time. Now, that maybe is an option. It's still that would all have to be worked out. But I think that would, that was not something that, when I recall this period, it never felt like that. That wasn't, I think, something that was put to me. It was more just, this should just be done, not we are happy to pay for this because we want to do something differently and this will be paid. It was a different type of conversation, and I think in the future, whoever is having to deal with this will have to just think through that question.
So I don't want to, for a moment, put words into your mouth, but really, I think you seem to be saying, retain flexibility, retain an ad hoc ability to respond to the particular emergency with a number of factors on the table, but you're making the point there's a lot lying behind this that also needs to be factored in.
Yes, I think that's a good summary. And look, the UK government always has the ability to do things asymmetrically and has done in lots of different, whether there's a bespoke case of a business in distress or something else. The UK government has always done that in all DAs and can do. I'd slightly differentiate between things that potentially are very open-ended, open-ended financial commitments that other people are making, that the UK government is, that would, anyone in any walk of life would treat those slightly differently to something that has a fixed cost.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Can we move on then to the coronavirus job retention scheme as a topic, now moving into particular schemes, and just by way of context, the Treasury HMRC final evaluation concluded it was good value for money with a positive net benefit to society of £50 billion. The economic output would have been 1.8% lower in 2021 without the scheme. It saved 4 million employments and 20% of employers who use the scheme, so it's about 250,000, would have closed permanently without the scheme. And I just want to give that context for the questions that follow. And in fairness, I've just asked that this is put up, INQ 000 588 209. This is from the Inquiry's listening exercise, Every Story Matters, page 107. This was about the extension, but it's making the point. I think the extension was a lifeline. It gave me peace of mind knowing I had some income coming in. So there has been a generally positive evidence received by the inquiry about the scheme. Now, I think you mentioned this earlier, Mr. Sunak, but there's also evidence from our expert, Mike Brewer, that as a scheme, it also worked well in terms of reducing what could have been an increase in inequality because of its preservation of jobs. So we take all of that on board. Can I ask you about engagement? I think there was heavy consultation between the Treasury and the Trades Union Congress, is that right? About this scheme and standing it up, and with business indeed?
Yes, not just the TUC who, we had, probably somewhat surprisingly, but we had a very good, close working relationship with Francis and with Kate throughout the pandemic, particularly at this phase, but also with the CBI. And obviously those are the two big organisations representing business, representing union labour. But beyond that, we were constantly talking to lots of other business groups as well, whether it was the BCC, the FSB, and in particular on furlough. I think the engagement, there was a lot of engagement, which I put in the evidence, but it's important, with all the various bodies of accounting and taxation, all of whom have acronyms I don't immediately spring to mind, but Institute of Chartered Accountants and other things like that, because there was a lot of technical detail to get right about the guidance and how it would work and what needed to be on the form and how people's payroll systems would interact with it. So, that degree of detail guidance that people don't always see was incredibly important. So, yeah, of course, there was TUC and CBI engagement, and that gets a lot of the probably headline attention. But actually all those expert bodies and accounting firms that helped get mechanisms, the guidance, the execution right, so this thing worked legally and operationally for businesses, it was equally important.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about journalists who were waiting for it to fall over, but I mean, is that the point? That it was not just devising the scheme, but also making sure it worked, operationally it worked?
Yeah, it worked operationally from a kind of IT perspective almost, but also just practically and administratively for businesses, and how the information they would need to provide, how their payroll systems worked, how HMRC could interact with everything it needed to, and so all those bits needed to. And instead, the kind of overall policy, once it was designed, in one sense, was actually quite simple, and that was one of its appeals, I think. But then underneath that was a lot of detail that needed to be.
And can I pick up on that point about simplicity in terms of design? We heard a lot about this from Dr. Tim Loynig, that he viewed one of the beauties of the scheme was that it was so simple, that was one of its great virtues, certainly when it was introduced in March 2020. And is that how you viewed it?
Yeah, I think it will be a recurring theme, I would imagine, of today and tomorrow. We go back to those overarching things that I talked about at the beginning, and complexity helps you target more effectively, better value for money, better for ensuring economic outcomes can return more rapidly and more efficiently, etc. Better for, we'll get into, I'm sure, fraud and other things. Obviously, it will help with all those things. What it doesn't do is allow you to move quickly. And it is very much the enemy of speed, and as we've talked about, speed was of the essence at this time. But the other thing that simplicity has and universality has is to help you with what I talked about at the beginning about the overall reassurance, and actually to be able to stand up and say, this is what the government is going to do, whether it's on this or the other things that we'll come to later, which people can just easily understand and has a simplicity and a universality about them, I think is probably underappreciated benefits for providing the overall kind of macro reassurance and confidence to the country, as well as operationally just being quicker and easier to deliver at pace. So I think that's the other benefit of simplicity.
And does that, in a way, minimise the danger that you announce something and then people go to it and find they actually don't qualify, they actually can't apply because there are all these rules and
yes, I think that obviously the simpler you can make it, as I said, as anyone can easily understand, then the better. And what you really wouldn't want to do is have too many situations where people hear one thing and then actually it's very different. So that's again that tends towards universality. If you're trying to have a big moment, talk to the country, give them a degree of reassurance. If that press conference just read like a whole long list of T's and C's at the end of an advert, I think it will undermine what you're trying to achieve. So if you had too many of those T's and C's, and again, they would help you for other things, but they would undermine the overall objective of just providing that reassurance and confidence, as I said, as well as making it far less likely that you could deliver it quickly and effectively and it would work.
And as you've told us, at the outset, February, March 2020, speed was really important. And therefore standing this up in 55 hours was important. But you yourself, you've spoken again about the iterative approach to these things. Once it was stood up in that simple, universal way, you've also got to wear the hat of the nation's bank manager and make sure that you're living within your means. And did you yourself, or were you concerned to see, OK, we've stood this up, it's been stood up in a simple way, but can we actually now refine it as it goes to see if we can do some targeting and if we can make sure that it is targeted and therefore better value for money?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is is one of the great bits of kind of in my head, kind of quandaries. We spent an inordinate amount of time over the summer iterating a more targeted version of furlough, and hours and hours of work to do exactly that, on the basis then that we were moving to a different phase of the pandemic. We weren't anticipating second, third national lockdowns, etc., and trying to figure out how to do a more targeted version. Because of course, as you said, if there were ways to get help to the people we want, but minimise the cost and make it more economically targeted to help the recovery of economic activity, that would be preferable. And I spent an enormous amount of my kind of intellectual time on this topic with the team at the Treasury, and we did develop something called JSS, which never saw the light of day because we ended up in another national lockdown. And
this was the job support
scheme, yeah, which had a kind of open and closed version. I know lots of people say, well, if you had better data, you can target, and I'm genuinely not convinced that even with better data, or reasonable better data that could now be collected, that it would be able to design an effective targeted version of this.
Right. Well, can we hold that thought?
Oh, fine.
And because I really want to develop this
sure.
and understand it, because I think you've spent a lot of time in the Treasury thinking about this and looking ahead. It's important it is considered. So,
yes.
But first of all, can we think about how you let's leave aside the practical difficulties and everything else, how you might think about targeting? I mean,
Yes.
there are lots of different ways. You might think about what companies that are affected by MPIs. Or?
There's kind of three main ways. One is sectors. So you can target by sector. The second way is to target by NPI, to your point, kind of closed, open. And then the third way is by looking at impact on revenue. And there are different tunes you can play on that, to use the Treasury parlance, of whether it's backwards looking, whether it's concurrent and things. But those are the three main ways that one could think about targeting. And there are problems with all three and advantages of all three, which I'm happy to dig into. But those are the three different approaches that one could take.
And can I throw in a fourth for your consideration? Though you may be including it, I suspect, under businesses targeted by MPIs, and that's geography.
Yes, I'm including that in because obviously and I mean this was the big module 2 discussion. I said all of the geographic stuff in reflection did not feel like that was something that would necessarily be repeated, I don't think. But in any case, that is, yes, I put that in the MPI bucket.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so if I was going to say a fourth, it's slightly different. But those are the three, what I call targetings. What we ended up doing is a form of targeting, but it's not quite targeting, which is what we did do is what we call tapering, which is changing the generosity of the support. So our answer to this question, having concluded, or my answer to the question, having concluded that there wasn't a way of targeting that I felt comfortable with, that I thought was right, we ended up doing what I called tapering, which is where we raised the cost to employers in a universal way of participating in the scheme, which has the indirect benefit of for those that don't really need it, it probably on the margin makes it more likely they don't use it as much because you've raised the cost to them, and that I think broadly worked quite well both times that we tapered out, and so that is said it means that it's still universal, but it was the generosity of the scheme was designed in a different way to just raise the cost to employers, which helps target by self-selection in a way, at the cost of some people having a burden which for them might be a bit more difficult than you would like.
So let's just pick that up, and then we'll look at the other three principal ways that you sort of looked at, and I think have settled on saying you reject. But this first point about tapering, I think this was a point that Dr. Loynig made in reaction to the suggestion it wasn't targeted. He said, well, no, it is targeted. Furlough was always targeted because it's self-targeted in the sense that you assume that business wants to make money and it wants to make a profit. Otherwise, what's the point of being in business? So it's in the interests of employers to bring their staff back when they can, and they can be profitable. Therefore, it is self-targeted in
effect. Yes. I mean, look, obviously, you are I think Tim would agree with this. He's right. What you are doing is introducing something that alters the pure behavioural response of a business, because you know there's this other thing that you are doing, and on the margin that probably means that someone where the business could have absorbed a cost reasonably and just dealt with a bit of reduced demand, some of that cost is now shifted onto the taxpayer balance sheet. The business is maybe not as productive as it otherwise might have been. That is the inevitable consequence of it. But he's not wrong. Of course, it is self-targeting in that case.
Yeah, and I suppose it might depend on what the nature of your business is, in terms of whether you are more or less inclined to bring people back. If you're talking about a manufacturing sort of model, you need people in the factory to make widgets. Therefore, you bring them back when you can make money.
Widgets,
yeah. Okay. All right. So let's leave that there in terms of the extent to which it was targeted, and you've spoken about tapering. But let's look at the other options, because I really want to be forward-looking here.
Yes, yeah.
Because next time someone else might say, well, could we target a scheme? Targeting by sector, why was that considered and or rejected as a prospect?
And I think, just to clarify, I don't necessarily reject them. That's probably too strong a word. There is a reasonable case for all of these, and it won't be me doing it in the future. So whoever is there might choose reasonably to do something different, and fair enough. I don't think that's an unreasonable proposition. My reflection is, I think someone in the same situation as me, even in the future, will probably end up doing the same thing, but for the reasons we'll go into. But I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad idea. I just think the benefits of it are probably not outweighed by the costs. And I think, indeed, you've heard other people use that phrase. That's where I'd probably personally end up on it, not to say that someone couldn't reasonably take a different point of view. So do you want to start with sector? Yeah, I think that the government doesn't have a database that has every business attached to a sector in the first instance. Now, you could probably develop that. Sector is quite broad. Then you need subsector, third sector, etc. That all gets a bit cumbersome. So we didn't have anything like that. So it would have all been self-declaration anyway. And then you need to figure out, well, how are the MPIs impacting each sector? And say this sector is in, that sector is not in. And sure, easy, restaurants closed, great. Well, if your sector is hospitality, subsector is restaurant, tick. Okay, you're the person who provides the uniforms for the people who work in the restaurant. So your subsector is something else, right? Textiles, or and then your subsector is whatever it is. Are you in? Are you out? Trying to figure all of that out is incredibly complicated in a modern economy. And then no one's going to be binary. I mean, the restaurant is 100% zero. Lots of other things. Well, part of my business is serving this sector. Part of it's serving another sector. Part of this sector is impacted. Part of it's not. So I just don't know if you could ever accurately figure out, well, these sectors suffer enough economic impact from the MPI so that these sectors tick, 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 these sectors no, no, no. And then even if you've got a firms operate in different sectors, and then you'll end up with all these problems of, well, half my business is my workwear example, half my business is serving this manufacturing uniforms, they're all still operating, half my business is serving the restaurant industry, they're all shut. Am I in? Am I out? Have we captured them even in the first place because we're focused up here on hospitality? So look, that's the thing with sectors. So even if you had the data, which we don't, it's not obvious to me that you would end up knowing and getting it. You could clearly do you could do a job. You would spend all your time talking to all the businesses that were not included, is my sense. And it's just the complexity of doing that for 1 million businesses, I just think in reality is probably not one that would work.
And it sounds like that the answer to that is not in better data, because of this sort of supply chain issue, the interrelationship between all these different businesses.
That's my sense. As I said, look, we don't have the data, we didn't have the data then, so someone can decide whether it's worth doing it. My instinct is, even with the data, that's probably not what policymaker in the future would do. But again, reasonable people could disagree on that point, and that would be fine.
Financial impact?
Again, for us, there's no way to check, right? So we had no way to. So for us doing it at the time, at the beginning, we didn't have a way to check, so it would all be self-declaration. What we did have was only for VAT-rated businesses, which have to provide that information. But
just pausing there, Mr. Sunak, we've heard some evidence, I think, that the threshold is about somewhere in the 90,000s,
yeah, 95,
I think.
So, from memory, yeah.
So a lot of businesses who
Lots of small businesses were not registered for VAT. I think 40-something, that seems a high number, but a large chunk of the businesses that use furlough were not VAT registered, I think. So again, you had no way to verify anyway on that data. We'll probably get into it on some of the future things. Now, in general, I think it would be a good thing for the government to have more regular income data. We'll get onto it for self-employed and for businesses. That is now happening through making tax digital. So again, not everybody loves that, but that's a good starting point for having more regular revenue data collected. So you would probably have some of that. The issue is there's two different things. One is if it's backwards looking, or is it contemporaneous with what's happening and then picked up in the future, it can create some quite odd behavioural incentives. So you're saying we're going to give you support if your revenue is low, and then you'd have to think through whether economically that is a sensible thing. Now, clearly for some people it's fine because you've shut them down, the revenue is zero, nothing you can do about it. But for the people who could, if they innovated or iterated, you'd want them to produce. And I'd take Tim's point. Tim would agree with this. We saw this improve over the pandemic. Right at the beginning, everyone just hunkered down, shut down, and we then spent time saying, well, hang on, actually the rules allow you to do this type of activity, or you can shift your business from doing sit-in to delivery and takeout. You want that type of economic activity to happen. And so having things that kind of reward almost not having that revenue would behaviourally worry me a little bit. And then if you were setting thresholds, which ultimately we did for SAYS, you inevitably get the question, well, how much revenue decline is enough to qualify for the thing? Which again, you'll just have to pick a thing. It won't be perfect, and people have revenue declines for MPI related reasons. Some people have revenue declines for non-MPI related reasons, so it's not perfect anyway. But I think, and operationally doing all of that would be fiddly. Verifying it would be fiddly, and then the behavioural reaction to it would be something to think about. Again, none of this is in. You could do a version of this. Yeah. It would not be an unreasonable approach to take. These are not binary yes or no things. Again, it's complex and it's imperfect. So you're just switching one degree of imperfection for another, and you're losing the universality and speed, and therefore you just have to weigh those things up. And then MPIs is the third. Yes,
MPIs is the third. But just before we come on to that, just a point that I'll just put to you now. But also, you've spoken about how rapidly developing this pandemic was and changing over time. Is that an argument against targeting of the sorts we've discussed and we'll go on to discuss? Because you might have to change the targets. It's a moving target, in other words.
Well, and that was our experience over the summer and the autumn, where we actually designed a targeted scheme, and then as the health situation deteriorated and we ended up anyway with a national lockdown, it didn't make sense to do that, and we went back to the original CJRS. And that goes to the third bucket, actually, which is the MPI one, which is exactly to your point. The issue with that is it slightly is the same set of issues we discussed with the sector-based approach. Is, okay, MPI shuts down a nightclub, or it shuts down a hospitality or large event. That's fine. But all those businesses have a supply chain behind them, and how then you end up in the same place, and it's pretty binary there. Which is what JSS was. It was, if you're closed, then fine. But then we had an open version, so we had a kind of softer version. It wasn't if you were, for everyone else, where that was the supply chain business was still going to get some support. but they were going to get less support than someone who was totally closed. And that's where we ended up. And we never introduced that scheme. It's the best we could do. But even then, I tell you, the amount of hours we spent, days of trying to figure out how we would detail the guidance for what businesses is closed, because part of the business was closed. The garden centres, I think, were kind of case in point, and that the cafe bit of it was closed, but the garden centre bit was open, things like that. So even there, we were trying to work through all this detailed guidance, and it was not going to be easy to deliver in practice, I don't think. And on the geographic side, again, it sounds simple, but lots of businesses that were not in that geographic area that was subject to the MPIs would be impacted by them because they'll be part of a supply chain, and trying to pick all of that up would be, well, you would lose it if it was geographically concentrated. It would work for a certain group of businesses, but then it would miss lots of others too. So, again, none of these are unreasonable. We ended up developing one. Because your overall point was right, and I cared about trying to figure out if there was a better way to do this. Is there a more targeted way that would save us money and help economic activity return? And so we developed one the best we could. As I said, it's not obvious to me the benefits of doing any of these things outweighs the costs. When you've got tapering as a kind of different way to do something similar.
Can I just pick up with you a few other
Yes.
Potential design points? I think more for a future emergency than for COVID. Just they've emerged in the evidence, and just would appreciate your reflections on them. One came from Dr. Tim Loynig again, which was the proposition that you should publish from the outset a list of recipients of the furlough.
I think that is not unreasonable. We did that later on. I think in November we introduced that, and I think next time around you could do that from the beginning. I mean, I'm trying to think why people might not like that, but I think we did it in general because at least employees then knew, and this is one way of combating fraud, which in any case in the overall scheme, fraud was much lower than people thought, and in line with other government programmes developed in peacetime. But again, the employees, notifying employees that they've been furloughed, them seeing the employer, it all just helps with that to make sure that there isn't fraud there. So that would be not an unreasonable thing to do from the beginning.
And is there another point that it might discourage companies that don't really need the money at all? They're just making...
Yes, and I think Tim spoke about this. There were obviously a set of companies that made a decision that they were going to pay the money back because things turned out better for them than they thought it would be, and it's enormously to their credit that they did that. And saying, lots of people want to have a go at business lots of the times. Those businesses that did that deserve, praise and gratitude. They didn't have to do that. Lots didn't, but they did, and as you said, country's bank manager, I'm grateful that they did.
Having part-time furlough from the outset in a future emergency?
I think, again, reasonable people could disagree on this. It's quite hard to police, and I think the nervousness would be, does it incentivise people to, on the margin, have less economic activity than they probably could or should? And I think that is it's just a choice and a trade-off. It was, I think the first lockdown in any case was so binary that it didn't make a massive difference, I don't think, in this case. Maybe that would be different in the future. It was easier to implement it later and not worry about what I worried about, because at that point you had a fixed population. So it applied to everyone who had been furloughed already. So you knew that you were not on the margin making it more likely that someone would kind of put their employees down to part-time when really they should just have to manage that in their business cost and not send that cost to the taxpayer. So it was an easier thing to do later. It was a big ask from business, especially FSB, I think, were particularly vocal about it, and it worked well, and it really helped get economic activity back up. I don't have a strong point of view on whether it could could or should be done from the beginning. I don't think it made a big difference in this instance. And again, it's a trade-off, really.
This was an idea that emerged from the evidence of Kate Bell on behalf of the TUC. The proposition that employers should be required to provide training to employees during the period of furlough to prevent de-skilling of the workforce. How does that... I'll give you an example. If you're a baker, or to use Dr. Loynig's example, you're a patissier and you're making shoe buns, I think was his example. You can't do that, but you might do some health and safety training, or training about hygiene in the kitchen, or if you're a barrister, you can't go to court, but you might do your CPD points. What do you say about that sort of...
I'd have to... I know that sounds fine. I mean, it depends how much of a burden on the employer it was, is my instinctive answer, and we're getting into kind of the micro policy development. So I think the whole point is here, the businesses were under, and lots of them small businesses, were under enormous stress. We all thought, well, we worried that they were about to go out of business, and the whole point about this thing was to ensure that they didn't have to lay off all their employees, because we wanted to protect that job match and protect that business. So if you're saying to that small restaurant or cafe that shut down, by the way, you still have to pay your rent, and we're going to help you with some grants over there and a loan over there, but you've still got a lot of costs that you're grappling with, and you're not operating, and we've done the furlough thing, but you have to now spend, that would be an extra cost, effectively, that you're putting on the business, and I think you would just have to think through that. If the whole point is you're worried about the business going out of business, then you probably say, let me keep you alive, rather than figure out if any extra costs. In principle, clearly, if you've got the time, it feels like a sensible thing to do. I think there has been some survey evidence that suggests that something like 40% of people, it was in your evidence somewhere, or maybe it's in my evidence, I think something like 40% of people did actually undertake some type of training whilst they were furloughed. And obviously now, with all the AI tools that we have, it's quite easy for people to do lots of things online and free, and they'd have the time to do that. I'm not sure about putting an obligation on the business necessarily would serve the ultimate aim of trying to protect the business and the job.
The scheme allowed people to take on work for another employer. So if you were furloughed, you could work for another business. Do you think... which presumably is a good thing in terms of churn in the labour market. People might find a different job they're actually better at or better suited to, and they could move on. Do you think that was well enough publicised, this ability to work elsewhere?
To be perfectly honest, I don't have a strong recollection of that particular policy and how we communicated it, or how it worked, or how well taken up it was. You have to forgive me.
No, not at all. Can I just pick up one other thought that's emerged, and then we'll take the lunch break. This came from Dr. Brewer, one of the inquiry's experts, and has been picked up in the evidence. The idea that you could have a right to request furlough, and the point Dr. Brewer was making was that whether an employee was furloughed or not was a decision for their employer. So they may not want to lose their job, they may not want to be made redundant. If they were made redundant, then they fell into universal credit and welfare, and comparatively that could be quite a significant fall in income. Not their fault, is the point he was making. So that there should be a right for them not to demand that they're kept on, but to at least request through a process that they be kept on through furlough.
I think that is... I have to think a little bit more about that. Probably instinctively, I'm not sure that's what I would do, not least because, especially if you're going to put, as we did, the tapering requirements on employers, where they would have to contribute more, then having someone kind of be able to force their employers, because then you are effectively forcing them to keep you on, not full-time, but at a cost. That seems a bit tricky, right? Those two things then work against each other, and I think ultimately it's, the employer's the one that is making the decisions about their workforce, the government forcing them to make those decisions. That doesn't strike me as being quite the right approach, and as I said, would make any type of employer contributions and tapering much harder to defend, and make it more likely then that people are just let go, which I think it would not be the outcome that we wanted.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Sunak, I'll leave it there. After the lunch break, what I want to pick up on CJRS is the approach in the autumn of 2020 when JSS was shelved and furlough was extended. So we'll pick that up as an issue after lunch, if we may, my lady. And we're not very far behind my plan, so we're slightly behind, but that's my fault, not yours. But we'll make it up this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I shall return at 2 o'clock. All rise.